Well, hello, young persons. Oh, I'm not in California anymore. I guess I can call you ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for coming here. So the topic I'm going to discuss is very broad, and it's historical, and it also has contemporary ramifications, and it's basically the relationship between, do you hear me okay? Yeah, all right. Between the relationship between Islam and the West, which was called, of course, Christendom in former years. And so let's get down to it. I think the best way to start is to get a quick primer about Islamic teaching when it comes to Christianity specifically. I guess the good news is talking to this lot, I think you're actually better educated than most people when it comes to Islam, unlike most colleges that I speak at or schools. So, but for simplicity's sake, you may have heard about how Islam, one of the apologetics or apologias is basically that, Jesus is a prophet for the Muslims, and that's a good thing. It's a bridge. We can become friends, et cetera, et cetera. Muslims believe that Jesus was born of a virgin, that he was perfect, he was sinless, and that he performed miracles. Sounds good. But they denounce his divinity. He's not the Son of God. He did not even get crucified, nor did he die a normal death, the death that we know. And he wasn't resurrected, nor did he die for the sins of mankind. So basically, the cardinal issues of Christianity are forcefully rejected in Islam, in the Quran. Very, very vehemently. I could have quoted you some verses. But probably the main verse that you should be cognizant of is Quran 9:29, which I'm kind of paraphrasing, but it's almost verbatim. It's basically fight the people of the book. The people of the book are identified as the Christians and the Jews, or the people who have scriptures, until essentially they submit and become Muslim or pay jizya, which is tribute, and live as essentially second-class citizens. The verse says, pay tribute while feeling themselves humbled. And then within Islamic law, there's all these teachings about how a Christian, if you are a citizen under Islam, how you have to be treated in a very rather bad way, essentially. You're like, again, second-class citizen. You can't build churches, you can't repair churches, you can't speak about Christianity openly, proselytization will get you killed, blasphemy, which is saying anything against Muslims, against Muhammad will get you killed, etc. So I think you know that part. So that's the doctrine, and then now here's the quick history, 14 centuries worth. Basically, on the death of Muhammad, this is when Islam has been consolidated in Arabia, because his wars were against fellow Arab tribesmen who did not want to submit. And remember, the word Islam means submit. It's basically, it's interesting because now it has this sort of religious connotation the way Christianity does, but in the early times in Arabia, it was just, the Arabic word is aslam, means submit, give up, surrender to me. And a Muslim is one who has submitted. And that was it. Islam doesn't care, Muhammad didn't care, and Allah doesn't care about the condition of your heart with God, et cetera, et cetera. You have to submit to the political authority of Muhammad. And then afterwards, his successors, or the so-called caliphs. At any rate, he had, once he had consolidated Arabia, and he died in 632 AD, this is when the jihad now, the global, the first major wave, known as the Arab conquests, blows out and starts conquering lands. Now, it's important to talk about these lands because when you hear these countries, Egypt and Syria, North Africa, Algeria to Morocco, and so forth, many of you, again, maybe not you, because I think you're a little more educated than that, but most Americans just think of those nations as always having been Muslim. Of course, those were actually the oldest Christian regions of the world. And if you looked at the time in the 7th century when this jihad that I'm describing happened, if you looked at the totality of the Christian world, of course, it was in Europe, basically, well, not in Germany, but southwest of the Danube Rhine, but the bulk of it was in North Africa and what we call the Middle East. Greater Syria, which encompassed modern-day Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, was one of the oldest Christian regions. The 5 ecclesiastical centers or sees, only one was in the west, Rome. The other 4, Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, and later Constantinople, were in the east. And long story short, once this jihad blew up, all that territory was swallowed up. So if you look at a map, and actual historians have sort of quantified it, Islam in 1 century conquered 3/4 of Christendom permanently. And it was the more ancient, more sophisticated, more learned center. That's why Constantine left Rome and moved to Constantinople. And to me, it's always mind-boggling how that chapter is just completely forgotten and ignored. And I've looked at textbooks, history textbooks that talk about world history, and none of this is in there. It's basically, you hear about how Arab culture spread in the 7th century. There's a euphemism. Often through trade, okay? So, I mean, that's a travesty if you really think about it. Anyway, this goes on. So Muhammad dies in 632. 1 century later, 732, you have Muslims in the middle of France. And this is the famous Battle of Tours, Charles the Hammer Martel, where he stops them. So now they had not only conquered all of the older Christian regions in the Middle East and North Africa, they conquered Spain, except for a small hold-up pocket of resistance in the northwest. Kind of looks like Idaho, in that Iberian Peninsula. And then it went into France, like I said, havoc, mass havoc, etc., slaughter. I'll get into the actual atrocities later, but I'm pretty fond of giving you quotes, because one thing that I do in my books, I don't want anyone to take my word for it, obviously. That's what other historians do. So I'm going to give you a lot. I'm going to drown you in quotes here. But before I do, so this war goes on, now it's 732, and it's there. But then it continues century after century, and then you have these different iterations. The Arabs start waning, and then the Turks come, originally as slave soldiers for Islam, and they're converted. And then they become the standard bearers of the jihad. They spearheaded against the rest of Europe. And this again goes on. You have the fall of Constantinople, but even before that, of course, we'll get to the Crusades. But here, let me give you, let's just fast forward to the end. This goes on now. So now in 1683, you have 200,000 Muslims surrounding Vienna, Austria. That's the famous battle, of course, the Siege of Vienna in 1683. And I bring it up now because it was recently in the news, and I'll get to that. But so in the battle, you probably have heard maybe of John Sobieski, the Polish king who led history's largest cavalry charge on September 12th that broke the siege, the Ottoman Turkish siege of Vienna, and basically relieved and saved Vienna. I bring that up anyway because only recently Poland created a statue of Sobieski, commemorating this event, the rescue of Vienna. And Vienna had originally agreed to put it up somewhere on the hill that he and his army had come down to save Vienna. Callan Hill, I think, I forget the name. And all of a sudden, the city council of Vienna started making complaints saying, oh, it's not the right size, or we need this, or we need that. And Poland spent like 10 years making changes. And then it finally came out and they said, look, we're just not going to do it. Why? Islamophobia. So now, so the statue was actually sent back, and now it's in Krakow, I believe. And it's kind of ironic that basically you have these people in Vienna, they're willing to spit in the eye of the people, or at least the descendants of those who saved them, in order to appease the descendants of those who are persecuting them. And if you actually look at Vienna, and we can maybe discuss that real quick, it's become a hotbed of Islamic radicalization like other European cities. At any rate, going back to the history, let me give you a couple of quotes. So here's Franco Cardidi, and he wrote the following in his book, Islam and Europe. He's a French, I believe, or Italian historian, well known. He writes, quote, if we ask ourselves how and when the modern notion of Europe and the European identity was born, we realize the extent to which Islam was a factor, albeit a negative one, in its creation. Repeated Muslim aggression against Europe between the 7th to 8th centuries, then between the 14th and the 18th centuries, was a violent midwife to Europe. And this is actually very accurate. The concept of Europe itself and how Europe came to be was in large measure created in response to a lot of violent pressure from Islam. I already mentioned to you how large original Christendom was. And so there's a reason when you look around Europe, it's surrounded by Muslims, right? South of the Mediterranean, Muslim lands, east of Russia, you actually have the Stan lands, the Mongol lands that also became Islamic, the Golden Horde. And so basically all of those were formerly Christian, they became Islamic through conquest, and it kept just going in and in deeper into Europe. Spain, like I said, the Balkans had all been conquered. A lot of people know of Constantinople, but obviously there was a lot more to it than that. Hungary, Romania, Greece. Here's now another good quote from Bernard Lewis, well-known historian, deceased now, of course. He writes, quote, "We tend nowadays to forget that for approximately 1,000 years from the advent of Islam in the 7th century until the Second Siege of Vienna in 1683, which I just mentioned, Christian Europe was under constant threat from Islam, the double threat of conquest and conversion. Most of the new domains were wrested from Christendom. Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and North Africa were all Christian countries, no less, indeed, rather more, than Europe. All this left a deep sense of loss and a deep terror." Okay, very accurate. It's very hard nowadays to come across such frankness in historical books that deal with this topic, except mine, of course. It's also worth mentioning that in the modern histories that people write, and I might try to get into the sort of semantic games that historians play to sort of whitewash all this, but these violent midwives of Europe are almost always now today known as Arabs, Saracens, Moors, Turks, Ottomans, Tatars. They're always given a national name, okay? But the reality is, if you dig into the sources, they saw themselves first and foremost as Muslims. And what they were doing was fulfilling the Islamic mandate via jihad. That's what comes out in their sources. So in other words, this wasn't just one of the games that historians try to play is like, okay, it's one national group attacking another, Turks attacking Greeks, okay, no big deal. But like I said, if you look into it, every time the rationale of these various groups, whoever they may be, is the ISIS rationale, the Islamic State rationale, the one that you've been told has nothing to do with Islam. That was the rationale for 14 centuries worth of jihad that completely terrorized much of the world, especially the Christian world. So one of the topics, for example, is slavery. I mentioned this, I think, to someone the other day, but here in America or in the West, you mentioned the word slavery. It means whites enslaving blacks. That's it. And it's kind of like amazing because the reality is, yeah, that did happen. And this is one of the problems. It's not that these historians or the fake histories that I'm discussing are lying. They always present things in a vacuum without telling you. So of course, in reality, everyone enslaved everyone. And Muslims especially enslaved a lot of Europeans. Based on a tally I did a while back, 14 million Europeans were enslaved by Muslims from as far as Iceland, from Iceland to Russia, okay? And this is mostly from the very beginning, from those centuries that I was mentioning in the 7th and 8th, but especially in the 15th and 16th century. In the 17th century, you may have heard of the Barbary pirates in North Africa. They subsisted entirely on enslaving Europeans. And I think in just a few decades in the 16th century, there was as many as 1.25 million European slaves in the markets of Algiers. But we don't hear about that, do we? So speaking of Barbary and trying to cap off this whole long, epic jihad that went on century after century, few people know that no one was spared, not even America. America's very first war as a nation after independence was with Muslims who were acting on the very same impetus that I'm describing to you right now. And I'm talking, of course, of the Barbary Wars. And so basically what happened is these North African Muslim vessels started attacking American vessels in the Atlantic and enslaving their soldiers and really mistreating them. You can see it in the sources. And what's interesting is Thomas Jefferson and I think John Adams met with one of the ambassadors from Barbary. And Jefferson then wrote a letter back to Congress. They met the ambassador to try to parlay and get the American sailors back. So Jefferson wrote the following in a letter from 1786 to Congress, quote, "We took the liberty to make some inquiries concerning the grounds of the Barbary pirates, pretensions to make war upon nations who had done them no injury, such as America, and observed that we, Americans, considered all mankind as our friends, who had done us no wrong, nor had given us any provocation. The ambassador from Barbary answered us that it was founded on the laws of their prophet, that it was written in their Quran, that all nations who should not have acknowledged their authority were sinners, that it was their right and duty to make war upon them wherever they could be found, and to make slaves of all they could take as prisoners, and that every Muslim who should be slain in battle was sure to go to paradise." You can only imagine what this enlightened thinker was thinking when he was told all this. But as you can see, I give you that quote because that is the rationale and the logic that Muslims had used in all those centuries before that I was discussing. From the 7th century, here we come up until 1800, 19th century. And it's the same logic. And it's the logic that we've been forever told has nothing to do with Islam and is just a representation of a handful of radicals, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, et cetera, et cetera. And the thing is, this was so well known, what I'm describing right now, which again, maybe not so much to you, but to most people in this country is just bizarre and they've never heard of it. This was so well known up until recently. So consider this quote from none other than Theodore Teddy Roosevelt, who was no mean historian himself. In his book, his 1916 book, Fear God and Take Your Part, he wrote the following: Christianity was saved in Europe solely because the peoples of Europe fought. If the peoples of Europe in the 7th and 8th centuries, and on up to and including the 17th century, had not possessed a military equality with, and gradually a growing superiority over the Mohammedans who invaded Europe, Europe would at this moment be Mohammedan, and the Christian religion would be exterminated. Wherever the Mohammedans have had complete sway, wherever the Christians have been unable to resist them by the sword, Christianity has ultimately disappeared. From the hammer of Charles Martel to the sword of Sobieski, Christianity owed its safety in Europe to the fact that it was able to show that it could and would fight as well as the Mohammedan aggressor. That's an American president that said that. Sorry, if you can imagine that. So let's fast forward to our dismal times and discuss a little bit of what I like to call fake history. You're all familiar with fake news, of course. Fake history, in my opinion, is much more dangerous because fake news is ephemeral. It does its mischief and then it's gone. Fake history props up and creates false paradigms of the past through which people sift modern day events through. And so it essentially poisons much of everything. Perfect example is the idea that the only people who ever enslaved anyone are white people, which a lot of people believe. I was watching one Rutgers professor, her name is Brittany Cooper, black woman. And that's basically what she said. She basically made it sound that the only ones who have ever enslaved anyone were white people. Everyone else got along historically when they landed on each other's shores, okay? And then she culminates it with, I guess just, white people are so committed to being villains, okay? And that's literally her words. Now you can understand why she thinks that because she's following a fake history. So that's the danger of all these fake histories. But in the fake history of the current topic, I'll give you one perfect quote from a professor. I don't know if you've ever heard of John Esposito, and he's a professor at Georgetown University, and he was actually there when I was there at the time, and he was a don. Whatever he said about Islam, he was the go-to guy. He's the author of more than 35 books. He was the editor-in-chief of numerous Oxford reference works, including Oxford Encyclopedia of the Modern Islamic World and the Oxford History of Islam. He was an advisor on many movies about Islam and documentaries, and perhaps most notably, he was the go-to expert, like I said, on Islam. He was constantly called on to brief the State Department, FBI, CIA, Department of Homeland Security, et cetera, et cetera. This is from his bio, by the way. So he writes, now keep in mind what I've told you about the history, the constant nonstop bombardment that began in the 7th century. He writes, 5 centuries of peaceful coexistence between Muslims and Christians elapsed before political events and an imperial papal power play led to centuries-long series of so-called holy wars that pitted Christendom against Islam and left an enduring legacy of misunderstanding and distrust. That's from his book, Islam, the Straight Path. What he's saying is that before the First Crusade, which was called for in 1095, from the birth of Islam, it's not even 5 centuries, but it's about 473 years from Muhammad's time until the First Crusade, those 5 centuries roughly were defined by peaceful coexistence. When 3/4 of Christendom was conquered and swallowed up, that was the peaceful coexistence times that got ruined by the First Crusade. These are the sorts of lies that are just being peddled. And like I gave you a little bit of his credentials and how sought after this guy is. And this is the stuff that he writes and that people read and that people believe. Which brings us to the Crusades, of course, which ironically to me, as important as they were really a drop in the bucket of the totality of warfare between Christians and Muslims. But they're the ones that you heard of because they make Christians look bad. because in the Crusades, you have Christians moving from their homeland into what's perceived as Muslim territory. So they're the aggressors, so we can talk about that. But if you look at all the wars, I describe them a lot in my book, Sword and Scimitar, again, that's just a drop in the bucket, because most of the attacks and the assaults were from the Muslims on Christian lands. And even the Crusades were actually part of just war. Recall that all those territories I told you about, including the Holy Land, Jerusalem, and Egypt, were Christian before Muslims took it. The first Crusaders were aware of this. So when they were going there, in their mind, they were liberating ancient Christian territories and bringing them back under Christian rule, which again fits into just war theory. But so what actually provoked the First Crusade again was a new wave of Islamic jihad and terror was taking place, especially after the year 1071, after the pivotal Battle of Manzikert in Asia Minor, close to Armenia. After the Turks won that, basically Anatolia, or Asia Minor, or what we now call Turkey, one of the most ancient Christian regions, it's where St. Paul wrote many of his epistles to, was overrun by Turks, and they just engaged in all sorts of atrocities and slaughters. And according to the contemporary sources, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Christians, mostly Greeks and Armenians, were butchered and slaughtered, and the rest taken into slavery. And again, the churches were desecrated ritually and burned and torched and turned into mosques. Just in one city alone, Ani, 1,000 churches were torched to the ground. And again, what I'm describing to you is right before the First Crusades, but all of these types of atrocities were what were occurring from the very start during the initial conquests that began in the 7th century. I mean, have you ever heard, for example, of the Mad Caliph, Hakim Ba'amrullah? In the year 1009, or 1009, he actually, according to Muslim sources, I'm thinking of the Arab historian al-Makrizi, destroyed 30,000 churches in 1 year in Greater Syria and Egypt. So again, that underscores how Christian that region was already into the 11th century and the sorts of persecution that Muslims were putting them through. So anyway, fast forward again to what I was telling you, 1071, Asia Minor is now being overrun and killed. And now here's a quote from Emperor Alexius I. He was the Eastern Roman, or as they call it, Byzantine emperor. And he summarized what was happening to Asia Minor and to Christians in a letter to his friend, Count Robert of Flanders, who would actually become one of the first leaders of the First Crusade. So here's a quote. "The holy places are desecrated and destroyed in countless ways. Noble mothers and their daughters, robbed of everything, are violated one after another like animals. Some of their rapists shamelessly place virgins in front of their own mothers and force them to sing wicked and obscene songs until they have finished having their ways with them. Men of every age and description, boys, youths, old men, nobles, peasants, and what is worse still and yet more distressing, clerks and monks, and woe of woes, even bishops are forcibly defiled with the sin of sodomy." So they were raping the holy men and the monks and so forth. So after the passage of these 5 centuries of peaceful coexistence, we finally come to the Council of Clermont in 1095, where Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade. He too knew what was going on. And here's a quote of what he said. "They, the Muslims, have completely destroyed some of God's churches and have converted others to the use of their own cult," meaning mosques. "They ruin the altars with filth and defilement. They circumcise Christians and smear the blood from the circumcision of the altars and throw it into the baptismal fonts. They are pleased to kill others by cutting open their bellies, extracting the end of their intestines, and tying it to a stake. Then with flogging, they drive their victims around the stake until, when their viscera have spilled out, they fall dead on the ground. They tie others again to stakes and shoot arrows at them. They seize others, stretch out their necks, and try to see whether they can cut off their heads with a single blow of a naked sword. And what shall I say about the shocking rape of women? Who is to repair this damage if you do not do it? Rise up and remember the manly deeds of your ancestors." And it is at that point that the famous phrase, Deus vult, came, where they all got up and said, "God wills it." So such are the heroic and noble origins of the First Crusade, which everyone has been taught is one of the blackest parts of Western Christian history of all time. We can get into some more of the lies. I'm not sure how we're doing on time. Are we good on time? Yeah. So some more of the fake histories you may have heard. You may have heard about like Al-Andalus, Muslim Spain, and just how wonderful it was, and how back when the Christians were poor and miserable and evil, and Al-Andalus was great. And this is, of course, when the Muslims entered and conquered Spain. And supposedly the golden age is something like in the 800s. Well, they don't tell you that it was so rich and opulent because all of its money and all of its wealth came through the slave trade of Europeans, that they were enslaving from northern Spain and France and the Mediterranean lands, or that they had plundered all their wealth. That was the source of their actual wealth. And just to give you an idea, at the heart, or at the peak of this so-called golden age, you have what's called the Martyrs of Cordoba, an interesting episode, where basically all these Christians who had sort of converted to Islam after the conquest of Spain essentially had enough, and they just unburdened their soul publicly and just said, we renounce and denounce Muhammad and we re-embrace Christ, et cetera, et cetera. All of them were tortured and killed in the most graphic ways you can imagine. They were skinned alive. The lucky ones were beheaded. Some were crucified. A woman was thrown in boiling oil. Okay, so this is Golden Age Cordoba, the part you never hear about. And, again, to show you what the academics do, whenever this comes up, there's this blame the victim thing that happens. So what happens is most academics say, oh, look at these stupid Christians. They got why would they ruin a good thing and offend the Muslims? Imagine, would they ever say that if it was the opposite? Would they ever say that if Muslims were forced to become Christians and they unburdened themselves and reclaimed Islam? Of course they wouldn't. Another one, I'll give you a perfect example, another historical book that I had to read and review, and it was pretty disgusting, but basically it's called Crusade and Jihad, the 1,000-Year War between something like the global north and the Muslim south, something like that. And the reason I knew about it is my book agent, mentioned it to me because it was coming out a few months before my book, which was titled Sword and Scimitar, 14 Centuries of War Between Islam and the West. So we thought it would be a competitor book. Anyway, I read it, and the book is a tome. It's something like 600 plus pages. And as you can see, it's trying to say it's covering all the centuries, right? 1,000 years war. In that book, the centuries that I described, the most violent ones from the 7th century up until, let's say, the 18th century, right before the colonial era, he gives it 20 pages, okay? This supposedly comprehensive book about Crusade and Jihad. And those 20 pages are the most hygienic pages you'll ever read about how Islam spread all over the place. You won't hear about conquest. You will hear none of what I'm talking about at all, okay? And then the good stuff comes. He finally reaches the point in the colonial era. Now Islam is weak, and now the West has actually entered and dominated Muslim lands and non-Muslim lands in Europe, in Asia and Africa. And now he goes with lurid detail into all many of them are imagined atrocities and horrible things that Europeans did. Okay, so obviously if you don't know better and you read that, and his whole point is to show you that Muslims have grievances and they're not forgetting this and they remember, et cetera, et cetera. And again, here's a classic, and this was a well-known book and assigned in colleges and universities and so forth. So the end result of all this is what? Obviously mass confusion towards the role of Islam. Most people still, at best, think it's a misunderstood religion. It's the religion of peace, as George Bush told us, of course. That's been hijacked by just a few bad apples. But like I told you, if you think of the worst behavior that you heard of from supposed ISIS, the Islamic State, whether it's the mass beheadings or the carnage that they engage in, the sex slavery, concubinage, selling Yazidi women, et cetera, all of that was on display for 14 centuries nonstop, but on an exponential level. These are the facts, okay? And, all of that has been jettisoned, and the fake history has done its work very well, because now you have Europe, who for centuries, I give you that Theodore Roosevelt quote, existed only because it fought tooth and nail against Islam. And what is it doing now? It's bringing in as many Muslims as it can possibly bring in. If you're not aware, but in a lot of these European nations, especially the Western ones, Sweden especially, the UK, Germany, which have significant Muslim populations, wherever you look, lo and behold, there's violence and criminality, churches are constantly being destroyed, religious statues of Jesus and Mary being beheaded, women being attacked and sexually assaulted, and the grooming that goes on in England. And all of this is, of course, not surprising because the continuity is very evident because it was always there from the start. That's what it was about. So that is the dangers of fake history. And we're living it right now because you don't appreciate what really happened. And I'll leave you the final and very prescient quote by Hilaire Belloc, a European, I think Anglo-French historian, I think a friend or contemporary of Chesterton, who lived between 1870 and 1953. In his book, The Great Heresies, which I think he wrote in 1938. 1938, keep in mind, this is about a century ago, or I mean, almost a century ago. He writes, quote, "Millions of modern people of the white civilization, that is, the civilization of Europe and America, have forgotten all about Islam. They have never come in contact with it. They take for granted that it is decaying, and that anyway it's just a foreign religion which will not concern them. It is, as a fact, the most formidable and persistent enemy which our civilization has had, and may at any moment become as large a menace in the future as it has been in the past. The whole spiritual strength of Islam is still present in the masses of Syria and Anatolia, of the East Asian mountains of Arabia, Egypt, and North Africa. The final fruit of this tenacity, the second period of Islamic power, may be delayed, but I doubt whether it can be permanently postponed." And I think that's where we're at right now.